Welcome to Feeling My Way Through the Grief, a podcast about the feelings and lessons learned along the grief journey. This is a place to be real, to acknowledge the hard stuff and the tough moments along the way after losing a loved one. It's also a place of hope, to embrace the fact that we're still in this world for a reason, and to walk forward as best we can, even though life is different now. I'm your host, Chris Martin. I've been feeling my way through my grief now for almost 4 years, after losing my wife of 20 years to cancer. Grief had me fumbling for several years, but when I took the time to feel and to express what I felt, I started experiencing healing. This podcast is intended to share some of my journey with you and encourage you to feel and heal as you navigate yours. Through this podcast, I'll share with you not only my story of loss, but my story of grief and healing. I'll walk through the emotions, the thoughts, the experiences, and the lessons I've learned along the way. One of the things that has been most healing to me during my grief is writing. I've written poetry to help process my loss, and I'll share some of that with you, in the hope that it will provide a point of connection with your own grief journey. I don't claim that the poetry is great, but it's been healing for me to write it. I also want to encourage you to feel the feelings, face them, embrace them, even when they're painful, and express them. Talk to a friend, write, paint, draw, sculpt, woodwork, knit, do a physical activity. Channel your feelings into positive expression and share them. I'm going to be really vulnerable about my journey in the episodes ahead, because I want you to see what that looks like for me. And because I want to encourage you to see what that looks like for you. I walked around in maintenance mode for much of the first 2 years of my grief. The true healing really didn't start for me until I looked the feelings in the eye, felt them, and wrote about them. In this inaugural episode, I'll share with you about my loss, who my wife Sarah was, and how she died. Episode 1. Getting Ghosted. It wasn't supposed to go this way. I was 41 years old. I had 2 kids. I had 3 living grandparents. My parents were still alive. And my wife beat us all to heaven. I met my wife Sarah in college. It was our freshman year. I was 17. She was 19. We ate dinner together at the campus cafeteria regularly as part of a mutual friend group. I really didn't think much about Sarah, other than the fact that she was a nice girl. For one of our classes, we were required to watch a movie together and write a paper about it. Sarah and I were in this class together, and we decided to attend the same movie screening and sit together. Now, I've never been the guy in the room that people feel that magnetic pull to, so I thought to myself that Sarah might show up, see another friend in the room, and go sit by them. But that wasn't what Sarah did. She showed up, saw me, and sat by me just as she said she would. I loved that. And somewhere in the weeks that followed, as I continued to get to know her, I realized I loved her. Sarah had a calm confidence, a quiet inner strength. She had a universal kindness toward others. She was humble. She was generous. She was an outstanding student. She had a lot of musical talent, a beautiful singing voice, an artistic streak. She sang in an elite choral group on campus. She was attending our college on both an academic and music scholarship. She had the most beautiful silky dark hair, beautiful hazel eyes, and an endearing Wisconsin accent, along with a cute little way of doing many things a little differently as a left-hander. She did everything with excellence and integrity. She was responsible, loved Jesus, and soon her boyfriend too. I started telling my college roommate all about her, extolling her virtues over and over until he was tired of hearing about her. He told me I needed to tell her I liked her or he would. The gauntlet had been thrown down. I resolved to tell her, but I was a nervous introvert. This was way out of my comfort zone, and I really hadn't dated before, outside of one short-term girlfriend in high school, and she had told me that she liked me first. This was different. I was deeply in love, and I desperately didn't want to do anything that could negatively impact my chances with her. It was the holiday season, and I invited her to do some Christmas shopping with me. She agreed to go, and it kind of surprised me, but she had no idea that I liked her. We did some shopping, grabbed dinner, and walked around the big lighted Christmas tree in the center of the city together. As we circled the tree, I told her my feelings for her. The magic of the holiday season was in the air, and my heart was full, but nervous. Sarah really didn't say much as we made our way back to the car to return to campus. Feeling incredibly emotionally naked, I asked her what she thought about what I had told her. She just looked at me with a peaceful calmness on her face and said she felt good about it. She later told me that it was kind of like blinders fell off her eyes that night. She had hoped in her heart that someone like I would love her someday, but somehow she didn't see that it was me until I talked to her that night. She never looked back. We dated throughout our college years, but quickly knew this was the relationship that both of us wanted for the rest of our lives. We looked at engagement rings about 3 months later. We were young and crazy in love, but we were also totally earnest and never wavered in our intention to get married. We would return to our respective homes over the summers between college sessions, she to Wisconsin and I to Georgia. While we were apart, we carried on vigorous email exchanges, with some highly savored phone conversations mixed in. This was in the days of long-distance phone charges, so we only talked about once a week, but our hearts were always with each other. Just after our junior year ended, Sarah joined me on a visit to my grandparents' house in Florida, and I thought it would be ideal to propose to her by the nearby Gulf of Mexico. One evening during the visit, I drove her to the beach, read her a poem I had written for her, and got down on one knee. She said yes, and the beautiful sunset over the Gulf that night was forever etched in our minds and hearts. We started planning our wedding and set a wedding date for the following summer. We enjoyed a honeymoon in Charleston, South Carolina before settling into our new apartment in Georgia. We had almost nothing but each other. Our apartment was sparsely furnished with hand-me-down furniture from family. But we started building a life together. We enjoyed our time together and served together in our local church. We looked forward to opportunities to travel. We took a special road trip to New England and Quebec for our 5th anniversary, and shortly afterward got pregnant with our first child. Sarah stopped working outside the home when our son was born, so she could focus on being a mom. She was an outstanding one. She doted on our son, took him on special outings, and enjoyed reading to him and playing with him with his favorite toys. We were a happy family of 3. Several years later, we had another child, a daughter. Sarah continued to be a great mom to both kids, and our lives were full. Sarah also poured herself into being a great homemaker. She loved to cook and perfected many recipes, always ensuring we had wonderful meals. She got involved in the kids' schools. She mentored people in our circle who needed extra wisdom about how to manage their finances. She encouraged people around her who needed a kind word. She made meals for people who needed some extra support. She baked cookies and treats for new neighbors, teachers, and friends. She supported, she cared, she loved. That was the backdrop for a dramatic change in circumstances that began unfolding in the years that followed. One day, she had some internal bleeding, so we went to the emergency room at our local hospital. They kept her for tests for several days, but the tests didn't identify any problems. About a year later, she developed some significant ongoing symptoms that would affect her daily life. She began fearing that something terrible was wrong with her, but she didn't want to see a doctor about it. One day she called me when I was commuting home from work and told me that she thought she had pancreatic cancer and suspected she had only a short time to live. I'm a peacemaker by nature, so I tried to reassure her. I did some internet research on pancreatic cancer to see if it seemed like a match with her symptoms. It just didn't seem to be exactly what was going on with her. I searched her symptoms online and discovered a condition called carcinoid syndrome that sounded very much like what she was dealing with. This condition involves small tumors in the abdomen that secreted hormones and often threw off some body functions. It was typically manageable with treatment. Although not ideal by any means, the good news, which I was quick to point out to her, was that it was usually far less life-threatening than pancreatic cancer. My hope was that by offering the prospect that her condition was less severe, it might help her to consider seeing a doctor. But she just refused to go. We would get into some of the worst arguments of our marriage over the topic. The cycle usually went something like this. Sarah would express her worries about her health. I would encourage her to go to the doctor and offer to help finding doctors and making appointments. Sarah would get angry with me for pushing and would essentially withdraw from our relationship for hours, days, even weeks. It was hurtful. Eventually, after the cycle had played out time and again, I insisted that she go to the doctor so we could get some answers and hopefully a treatment plan. Her resistance continued, but I finally got her to a general practice doctor and went with her to the appointment. The doctor ordered some tests. Sarah dragged her feet in completing them, but she ultimately did. No answers came from the test, other than a recommendation to see a gastroenterologist. I found a specialist for Sarah, and the cycle of resistance continued until she finally went to the appointment. The gastroenterologist ordered some additional tests, and Sarah never completed them. A few weeks later, at the start of my Christmas break from work, Sarah started experiencing excruciating abdominal pain. She could barely move. We went to the emergency room at our local hospital, and a CT scan revealed some tumors in her abdominal region. The hospital recommended consulting with an oncologist the next business day and set up an appointment for us. With the intense pain she was experiencing, Sarah was no longer dragging her feet about her medical care. It had become a necessity. During the oncologist visit, Sarah leaned over to me and told me that she was going to want to get a second opinion if she didn't like the doctor. Now, I wanted her to have great care, but candidly, I also really wanted to get her to a place of relief as soon as possible. Her pain was so intense that even the slightest bump in the road on the way to the doctor's office made her cry. The doctor recommended that Sarah have a laparoscopic procedure. This would insert small cameras into her abdomen to better understand what was going on inside. The doctor would also take biopsies of the tumors to determine exactly where they were located and whether or not they were cancerous. After the doctor left the room, Sarah told me she felt good about him. I did too, and we set up an appointment for Sarah to have the procedure the following week. In the meantime, Sarah needed a lot of help moving around the house because of her pain. She stayed in bed most of the time, and I helped her up when needed and helped her to the bathroom. The following week, Sarah's procedure determined that her tumors were cancerous, but couldn't easily be removed surgically, so the doctor recommended starting chemotherapy in the weeks ahead. During the procedure, the doctor released an intestinal adhesion, which had been causing the intense pain she had recently started experiencing. When she woke up from the procedure in the hospital, Sarah was unusually groggy. She wanted to rest some more before going home, which was really strange because she hated being in the hospital. She eventually rallied enough, and we went home. Her pain was quite a bit better. She spent most of the next 2 days in bed resting, but she had very little appetite and some nausea. We called her doctor to see if he had any concerns, but he didn't. He prescribed some medication for the nausea. On the afternoon of the second day after the surgery, Sarah was in noticeably bad shape. It was cold, but she was sweating. Her normally beautiful face looked awful. I thought she looked like she was on drugs, but thought maybe it was because she had just started on a morphine prescription for the pain. She still didn't have an appetite. She told me she thought she should go back to the emergency room. I called for an ambulance, knowing she was struggling to the point where it would be hard to get her down the stairs. The ambulance took her to the emergency room at our local hospital, and the staff worked on getting her fluid levels back up to a healthy place. They did a CT scan to check her abdomen. The scan determined that her intestinal tract was in distress. The ER doctor contacted Sarah's oncologist from her procedure 2 days earlier to get more insight about her case. He worked in the same health system. Not long afterward, Sarah's oncologist called me and told me he was going to come to the hospital to do surgery to try to save her intestinal tissue. I asked him about the risks. He told me he thought she had about a 95% chance of pulling through the surgery successfully. That was pretty reassuring. As they took Sarah back for surgery, Sarah and I told each other we loved each other and said we'd see each other after the surgery was over. I called Sarah's mom and sister, who were waiting for updates, and let them know what was happening. Then I took a much-needed bathroom break. Before I had even left the bathroom, the doctor called me, and I knew the call from him so soon was a bad sign. He told me Sarah's intestines were all black and blue. Her intestinal tissue had died. I asked him what that meant, and he said there was nothing they could do to save it, or her life. I asked him how long she had, and he said that she had days at most. He recommended having our children come to the hospital to see Sarah, and that we could talk to her. After confirming with him that there was nothing more he could do, I hung up the phone. I was completely numb. It had been a grueling few weeks since Sarah started experiencing her terrible pain, and I was spent. Emotionally, this was the last straw. I just sat in the waiting area with my eyes closed for a minute as the reality sank in. After summoning my faculties again, I called my mom. I asked her to bring my kids to the hospital. I called Sarah's mom and sister, told them the news, and answered their tearful questions as best I could. After my mom and kids arrived and Sarah had been brought out of surgery, we were ushered back to the room where she was. She was on a ventilator. Her eyes were closed. She couldn't talk to us. I had been under the impression that she would be able to, but it was only we who could talk to her. And we did. For the next several hours, I held her hand, and at one point, I felt her trying to clench her fingers around mine, and saw one of her eyes briefly open. We cried, we shared our love, and we mostly babbled. None of us expected this. It was all so sudden. We didn't even know what to say. My brain felt frozen. Some nurses came in the room and they told us that they needed to move Sarah to another room to use the space she was in for other patients. But where they were going to move her was surrounded by COVID patients when the pandemic was at its height. I couldn't put my kids, my mom, and myself in that environment and risk their health too. But I refused to cut our time with Sarah short. So I demanded that the nurses leave her there. We stayed with her until 4 a.m., and I decided to bring the kids home to get a little sleep. I planned to return to the hospital later in the morning alone. Not surprisingly, I didn't get any sleep, but I took some time to just be alone and cry. Less than 2 hours after we left, I got a call from the hospital that Sarah had passed away. I wasn't even there with her. I cried the deepest cries I've ever cried in my life. My heart was crushed. After I'd composed myself, I went to my kids' bedrooms and told them their mom had died. We hugged each other tightly and cried together. The day ahead was a quiet day of mourning together. I was so grateful to have my kids. We leaned into each other as we entered into this new world of grief together. In the days that followed, so many people from our family, friends, and community reached out to us and poured their love into us. They were generous with meals, with gifts, with kind words of condolence and remembrance. With the help of my church and Sarah's mom, I planned Sarah's funeral service, and my son and I picked out a spot in a local cemetery for her to be buried. After all the activity died down, after these intense weeks of health crisis, I found myself stepping into a whole new place and starting my grief journey. As a newly single dad working full-time, I couldn't fully process it all right away. But later, when I took the time to embrace and acknowledge my feelings and truly grieve, I found that I was starting to heal. I was feeling my way through the grief, feeling my way to the healing. That's what this podcast series is about. In addition to my story of loss, in the episodes ahead, I'll share my story of grief and healing. I'll walk through the emotions, the thoughts, the experiences, and the lessons I've learned along the way. As I shared at the top of the podcast, one of the things that has been most healing to me during my grief is writing. I've written poetry to help process my loss, and I'll share some of that with you in the hope that it'll provide a point of connection with your own grief journey. I also want to encourage you to feel the feelings, face them even when they're painful, channel your feelings into positive expression, and share them. I didn't begin to truly heal until I looked the feelings in the eye, felt them, and wrote about them. So, in that spirit, I want to leave you with the words that I read to Sarah when I proposed to her. It's a poem called Wisconsin Road, which I wrote about our relationship and the future I anticipated sharing with her for the rest of our lives. Although I didn't write this during my grief journey, it's a starting point to remind me what I've lost, a reflection of a dream enjoyed for 20 years and then deferred. Here's Wisconsin Road. 600 miles we each traveled just to meet each other. The most worthwhile 600 miles I have ever traversed. Yet I didn't even know it was you. Eyes blinded by a quest pursued in vain, until Father played matchmaker and showed us the obvious, and we realized all that we missed for the first chapter of our lives. Sweet melody meant solely for two, finally ringing loud and clear from joined hearts, fastened by a love from our Creator, never to be duplicated by another. Father brought me a princess when he brought us together, intricately beautiful and fashioned uniquely for me, just as I have been uniquely crafted for you. Comfort, care, and love I find with you. Sincerely yours, you sign your love letter to me with your eyes. Such sweet reassurance and calm, patient tenderness. A connection strong enough to join two together without any hope of severance. A smile that kills my sadness. Encouragement that defies my self-doubt. Hands that communicate love without speaking a word. A likeness with me unlike that of anyone else. Too much in common to be an ordinary overlap. Beauty surpassing all my expectations. Ability to make mundane moments some of the most special of all. Wonderful teammate and partner. My very best friend. A heart that follows God's leading. These are the reasons I love you, my Sarah. And the list will continue through a lifetime of discovery, uncovering beautiful landscapes in your life I've only caught glimpses of. Like a winding Wisconsin road, life will carry us to summits and valleys, twists and turns, overlooks and views from below. And the journey is a beautiful one that isn't half as beautiful without you. For when you're there, the sun is brighter, the flowers more radiant, the hills less arduous, the valleys more tranquil, the views more spectacular. And I can't wait to follow this road to the horizon and beyond with you, my one and only true love, as we, each an individual thread, are woven tightly together into a cord of three, cemented by the bond of love that first joined our hands and our hearts. Thank you for listening to this episode of Feeling My Way Through the Grief. I'm Chris Martin. Stay tuned for our next episode focused on the fog that sets in the initial stages of grief. If you like what you hear, please rate, review, follow, and share this podcast with others who may find it helpful. God bless you as you feel your way through.